what can we do? I'm gonna give it, I think, 2 minutes. I love time minutes, right? We're all slaves to the laws of time, and so if we start at 2:01, I'm gonna lose my mind. Terrible.
You're fine.
I always make my students wait in a little waiting room, and they're like, nobody else does that. You're really weird. And I only let them in exactly when class starts.
That's a good idea.
Well, you can't Zoom bomb if you're waiting in the waiting room.
That's right.
No Zoom bombing. There is no chit chat. We're here for business. No one's gonna have fun. That is my that's how I live my life.
That's my classes, at least.
Wow, there's a lot of people coming in.
I recognize all the names.
Okay, I'm muting everyone. We're going to keep everybody on mute while Emerald does her thing.
Why don't you go ahead and mute me too? Because it might be better that way.
No, I think we'll keep your
can self-mute, Emerald. You can self-mute.
You can, yes. And apologies in advance if you hear some crazy dogs barking in the back. I have little control over the beasts at this point.
Isn't that life? Mm-hmm. I am going to share my.
I'll mute myself as well.
Whoa.
Oh boy, I don't know what we can see.
Oh, okay.
Can't see a lot.
Oh, I can move everyone over here now.
Can everybody see my mouse, the red dot, the pointer? Great. It's 2:01. I guess we will. I guess we'll get started if everybody's ready.
Okay. So, welcome everyone to Emerald Thesis Defense. We're very excited about this. This is our first Zoom experience in Thesis Defenses, so that's super interesting. Greetings all from Kogalym. As you enter my space, you see the oil drop statue that's in the center square of the town. So just a few kind of rules of engagement. I'm going to keep everybody on mute and let Emerald do her presentation. After that, when she has completed that, myself and Dr. Popova, I'm her thesis director, in case you hadn't figured that out yet. Dr. Popova is her second reader. We will then ask her some questions, and then we will open up to audience questions, which should be submitted to me through the chat, and I will moderate them and pass them along to Emerald. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to mute myself and let Emerald take it away.
Fantastic. So today I want to talk to you about a Russian oil company that has made sort of significant capital investments in a tiny town in Western Siberia. The town is called Kogalym. The oil company is called Lukoil. And so why this is of interest to me is because these investments have sort of been happening on an ongoing basis ever since the 1990s when the company was founded. And Kogalym has been impacted in terms of identity and also infrastructure, sort of through Lukoil branding. And so some of the things that I sort of try to ascertain in my thesis and in this presentation, why Lukoil has made the investments in Kogalym, why participation in cultural infrastructure and cultural leisure has been so important for the oil company to try to solidify on behalf of the residents of the town. And I sort of asked the question, how will this affect Kogalym and the surrounding area? And so a little bit about the thesis itself. It's about 60 pages long with some, some other things in there. There are 5 sections. There are 3 scholars that have been particularly important in allowing me to sort of devise a framework to analyze the relationship between Kogalym and Lukoil. And the first scholar that has been important, probably the most important, is Douglas Rogers. He's an anthropologist who has written pretty extensively about Lukoil's dealings in a town called Perm. And Perm and Kogalym, and we'll look at a map in a little bit, are sort of in the same region of Siberia. And so even though Perm is much bigger and much older than Kogalym, there's some important conclusions that Rogers draws that have been essential in analyzing Kogalym for me. And his sort of experiences being directly in Perm have been very helpful in allowing me to analyze the relationship here. The second scholar is Elena Schulman, and she wrote extensively about Soviet women taking an active role in state building. And she defines this notion of the frontier, which is sort of quote unquote untamed spaces where women have the opportunity to sort of seek adventure and carve out a niche for themselves in burgeoning communities. And I borrow that and I define what I call the oil frontier. And the oil frontier is a town without a lot of industrial infrastructure, but with the infrastructure to harvest oil. And so I'm able to think about women's role in Kogalym and in oil towns and in regard to Lukoil and the oil industry in that way. And then the last person is Jennifer Suchland, and she writes about illicit economies, specifically prostitution economies. And so that's very helpful in thinking about towns without a lot of infrastructure and without a lot of drivers for economic growth. Because we sort of see that illicit economies will sometimes replace those things. And we can think about the ways then that oil will sometimes take over for those illicit economies as the town starts to grow. I also use census data and migration statistics to sort of figure out how Kogalym has changed over the years. And then there are several YouTube videos that have been produced by Lukoil that give us insight into the company's vision for the town, which has been very helpful in sort of trying to figure out how things stand and how things are changing. So a little bit about Kogalym. If you were to stand on the streets of the town, you would see Lukoil branding everywhere. And I've chosen this picture on purpose because we can sort of see right here that there's Lukoil branding and there's an oil drop statue. But this is not a unique picture. There are dozens of images and places in Kogalym where you just sort of stand and you see Lukoil signs or branding or even the Lukoil colors, very prevalent in the town. Kogalym is relatively small, but it's large for the region of Siberia that it's in. About 60,000 people. That's a 2010 estimate. We're probably closer to about 66,000 people now. We won't know until October when the census is conducted. So more on that later. The town was founded in the 1970s. That is when ground was broken. The town was actually developed by a couple of architects from the main building firm in Azerbaijan. And we think it's because of proximity to the Vatyaganskaya oil field, which is one of the region's largest reserves, and it is Lukoil's largest oil field. So if we take a look at the map, this is sort of a zoomed in version of, I don't know if people can see my mouse. This is sort of a zoomed in version of Russia, and we see what is the little mark that is circled is Kogalym. And then I've also circled Moscow, and that is because we hear a lot about Muscovite culture in Kogalym, and I just want to make clear that the two are separated by pretty significant distance. That's about a 24-hour car drive to get from one place to another. So I just sort of wanted people to see that physical distance as we talk about that. A little bit about Lukoil. It was founded in 1991. The president has been Vagit Alekperov since 1993, so not a lot of changes in terms of organizational structure. Company is technically younger than the city. I say technically because at the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we had oil companies sort of privatized, and Lukoil came out of that. But when we think about Kogalym as an entity, it has existed since the 1970s, and Lukoil has not. So it's sort of very interesting that Lukoil is so prevalent in the town, because it's only been about 30 years or so that there has been an opportunity for that to sort of come to pass. So this all started for me. With the dedication of the Malý Teatr. And about a year ago, the Kogalym branch of the Malý Teatr opened. And the Malý Teatr is a very famous theater in Moscow. It's more than 200 years old. And it's very interesting to me that a 1.7 billion ruble expenditure was made, which is about 25.5 million US dollars. And I converted that in March 2019 dollars. If I converted it in today's dollars, it'd be closer to 22 million, but that's neither here nor there. Such a large expenditure was made in a town of about 60,000 people. And in the press releases from the theater and from Lukoil, they talk about how we need to appreciate the classical arts. And it is important for us to make sure that Russians have access to Russian culture. And what's very interesting about that is that Kogalym is only about 60% ethnically Russian. And so there's sort of more to be said there in terms of the culture that is there and who needs access to specific kinds of culture. So later on, we're going to hear a little bit about a woman who is the deputy director of Kogalym's most significant museum, and she says it in Russian. This is my translation. She says Kogalym is the Moscow of the North, and she talks about having access to Siberian beauty and also having access to Muscovite culture, which is sort of encapsulated by the Malý Teatr. So talk about the facade of the building, right? They say this is exactly what you would see walking down the street of Moscow, and so it's here that we start to see these comparisons to Moscow really, really strongly represented in this theater. And I've thrown up two pictures sort of along the sides, just so you can see the sort of exhibits that are present in the theater as you are walking through the lobby to your auditorium. These are the kinds of things you'll see, very representative of, I guess, quote unquote, classical arts and the history of theatrical arts. Maybe less to do with Kogalym in general. And this little circle sort of down here in the bottom right picture, I couldn't find a good picture of that key. You can see it very clearly on video. I'm not technologically literate enough to make a GIF, otherwise I would have. But it is a large key that says Malý Teatr on one end and Lukoil on the other. So like the branding of those two things are merged and it's sort of very significantly and prominently displayed there in like a key, almost like a large key to the theater. And actually, if you were to log on to the Malý Teatr's website, you would see along the bottom a list of sponsors. The one in the biggest typeset most prominently featured is Lukoil. So we sort of see those partnerships displayed proudly, and in that way we sort of understand that Lukoil, in funding this expenditure, has deemed that the Malý Teatr is something that is important for the people of Kogalym to have access to. So I have picked a few images from Kogalym's Museum and Exhibition Center, and there is a lot more there than what I have displayed here. And I've specifically picked images that I found on review websites because I wanted you to be able to see the museum, not through a promotional lens, but as people who are walking through the museum see it, and what they think is important to capture. So you'll see things like boats for children to play on, and like structures and wheels you can turn, and like all sorts of valves that sort of represent the oil refining process. But right here in the top left corner, we have a train car that is set up for children to sort of run through, and on the left here it says Moscow, on the right here it says Kogalym. So it's like a very prominent visual example of bringing those two things close together. And so essentially what this exhibit in the museum does is it allows children to walk through the founding of Kogalym as the curators of the museum understand it. And so in telling that story of Kogalym, they sort of frame it as, in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, settlers came by train and they settled the town. That's not exactly what happened. We briefly mentioned earlier that it was actually architects from Azerbaijan who built the town. So the notion of like Russians settling Kogalym is not exactly true. And it sort of leaves out a lot of time and space that the people of Kogalym, or the area surrounding Kogalym, has experienced before the town was ever settled, right? There's an indigenous group called the Khanty people, which surrounds the town, that they live in the area surrounding the town, and were there long before the 1970s. And so the picture on the right and the picture on the bottom, these are two snapshots from a very large display case of various awards. And I have circled every time Lukoil branding is visible. There's only 4 in this picture, but if I were to zoom out and display to you the bigger picture of the bigger case, you would see like a large helmet that says Lukoil and some other things. And some of the things relate directly to the oil company and some things don't necessarily. And so here again, we have sort of like, we have sort of another key, right, that says Lukoil on it. And so as a child is walking through the foundation and the history of Kogalym, over and over again, they see Lukoil branding, and that is sort of a visual cue to them that Lukoil was influential and important in establishing the town, even though, as we've said, it's about 20 years younger than the town. So I want to talk briefly about the notion of the Siberian shift city. And a shift city is essentially a place that has been established to harvest natural resources or just sort of as a work encampment. And it's very bare bones in that you will have a living space and a place to eat, and that is about it. There will typically not be any stores, no services. You just have the people you're working with and a place to eat and a place to sleep. And that's about it, right? And if you've had the foresight to bring your guitar as this person has, you can play the guitar too. And so this is actually another picture of the Museum Exhibition Center, and this is sort of their understanding of the first settlers of Kogalym and the tents that they would live in. And so the thing about the shift city is it's not a fun place to be, right? There isn't a lot to do. You're not necessarily there with people you know. They don't even necessarily speak the same language as you. And so what tends to be on people's minds as they're working in these shift cities is, when can I leave? And in places like Kogalym, where you have huge oil fields that need to be exploited in order to obtain a return on investment and secure revenue, this is not an ideal situation. So the question is, how do we know when a shift city has been an appropriate place to settle or becomes an appropriate place to settle? In Kogalym, clearly it has been the population of 60,000 people and significant infrastructure and a theater. And so thinking back to the people who initially built Kogalym, built the first few buildings, we sort of find out that it was difficult to build on for various reasons. It's cold, it's very rural, you need extra insulation in order to just create a livable structure. So the question is, why bother, right? Why bother turning it into something beyond a shift city? And the answer is because there is so much oil to be had there that the best way to turn a profit is to turn it into something a little more significant. So you have people there who are willing to stay and work for the company and sort of exploit that oil for you. And so another thing we sometimes see with shift cities is we'll see illicit economies arise to replace economic growth. And sometimes it's a prostitution economy. It doesn't have to be. It can be an economy for papers or passports or any number of things. But the point is, it's something to replace economic growth in a state of arrested development. And so the question is, did this happen for Kogalym? Well, there doesn't seem to be a significant illicit economy. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was one or there wasn't one, but I guess the point is it has grown to the point that oil serves as that driver for economic growth. And of course, as we know, oil is perfectly legal to sell. So they seem to have met that qualification for being a place where you can permanently settle. And then finally, I've included a quote from the Uyghur government's electronic anthology of the area. And in it, the entry on Kogalym talks a little bit about the teachers who come to Kogalym, and they define them as energetic and excited and ready to take on the world. And so this is just the very beginning of that. And they talk about how every worker needs a secondary education. And so there are actually two indicators here that a shift city has become a place that is appropriate to settle. And the first is the presence of women. And the second is the presence of education. So in terms of working in a shift city, especially in an oil shift city on the oil frontier, you won't see a lot of women, in part because the oil industry is very reluctant to hire women to do physical labor. So there really isn't a place for them there. And by the time they get there, it's sort of an indicator to the men that are working there that, oh, okay, this has now become a place that is appropriate for long-term living. And of course, education, right? An indicator that there is a place for children to succeed in the town and have access to the things that they would need to grow up. So a little more about women on the oil frontier. I talked a little bit about Elena Schulman at the beginning, and in her understanding of women and their relationship to the state, she talks about patriotism and being excited at the prospect of adventure and really being able to take an active role in state building. And on the oil frontier, things are a little different. there is an interview in a now deleted YouTube video that I saved a mirror of because I had a feeling it was going to be deleted, by the deputy director of the Museum Exhibition Center. She talks about moving from Bashkiria in the early 2000s with her husband with the intention of saving money to move back to Bashkiria. And that never happened. She says, something about the beauty of the North just sort of compelled her to stay. And before she knew it, she had a whole life there. And so completely by accident, she found that she had taken a very active role in state building. Right now, she's the deputy director of the only museum in Kogalym. And so there is something to be said also about the role of women in terms of curating culture, especially in Kogalym, right? So the entire board of the Museum Exhibition Center is female. It's not just this one woman. The entire repertoire department of the Malay Theater is female. And so based on that, we can sort of see that women have a role in deciding what comes to the town and what the people of Kogalym can experience and should experience. I will tell you this, especially in regard to the Malay Theater, the directors are male. So the vision is executed by men, but the ideas are sort of curated by women. And in a way, they sort of serve as a legitimizing force in terms of how people see Lukoil, right? Because if a woman has decided that Kogalym is an appropriate place to spend time and to live, that sort of signals that, and that sort of stands as a signal that it's an okay place to be, then it goes to logically follow that that Lukoil's dealings with the town are of course legitimate, and the status quo should probably be upheld. Even though in some cases Lukoil sort of acts as more of a governing body of the town than necessarily an oil company. So I want to talk a little bit about programs and projects. And again, I know we mentioned Douglas Rogers at the beginning, but one thing that was a very important difference between Lukoil's dealings in Perm and Lukoil's dealings in Kogalym is that even though in both places the cultural education of people of the town has been impacted and affected, Lukoil has had special influence over the physical infrastructure of Kogalym. So the picture in the back of this slide is actually the Church of the Holy Martyr Tatiana, which is a Russian Orthodox church that was funded and built by Lukoil in 2017. And so the quote is from an article about that. It talks about how the president and the vice president of Lukoil were there and awarded patriarchal letters. And then also I've included a quote from Douglas Rogers' work where he talks about the impact of the folk tradition program on children. They say that participating in the project made them kinder, more honest, more responsible, better mannered, and more cultured, which I think is very interesting because it sort of implies that without Lukoil's intervention, they might have been less kind, dishonest, irresponsible, ill-mannered, and not cultured. And so the implication there is that the people of Perm are sort of failing to teach folk traditions to the children of Perm, and they need Lukoil's intervention in order to make sure that children are being taught the right things. And so in that way, we can sort of see the pervasiveness of the oil company in these towns and how access to endless wealth really sort of starts to define culture and identity and what people are learning and what they get to experience. So a note on the Khanty people, and I sort of threw these images up next to each other. One is, this image is just a Khanty family that has been photographed at home. And this is from the opening ceremony of the Malay Theater. And I think they sort of contrast each other in a very interesting way. And I will say clearly in the opening ceremony of the Malay Theater, they were not going for historical accuracy. I think probably camp was at the forefront of what they were trying to achieve. Even so, I think this representation of the Khanty people is very interesting, with the knowledge that there will not be other representation of the Khanty people in the context of the theater, right? So when they had, there was a picture earlier where you saw people sort of dressing up as aristocratic Russians with powdered wigs and old actors. And real representations of those people are pretty prevalent in the exhibits inside the Malay Theater. Not so much with the Khanty people. So this is the only representation of the Khanty people that is tied to the Malay Theater. And so I think it's very interesting that this is going to be the sole representation. It's just not quite right. I don't really have any pictures of the Khanty people in their indigenous dress, but I will tell you it does not look like this. It's very colorful. We see a lot of neon, and it just is very different than what is shown here. And so I have two quotes up next to each other. The first is from a half-hour-long special produced by Luke Oil about the town of Kogalym. It's called Kogalym, City of Oilmen. And we follow this television presenter. She comes to Kogalym and she sits with one of the heads of the western branch of Luke Oil, and they talk about how, you know, it's a terrible thing that even though Luke Oil has built like this high-tech kindergarten and this wonderful education system, people will grow up and leave Kogalym and never come back. They talk about brain drain. And then sort of in the middle of nowhere, she just goes to a Khanty settlement and she sits herself down in this group of women and they just have a discussion about Luke Oil. And she says, right around the 12-minute mark, it was with the full consent and cooperation of the Khanty people that Luke Oil acquired its land. But if we look at that claim, I was going to say it's not exactly true, but it's pretty patently false. So I have included this example, the one on the bottom, because it's a very famous one. A Khanty reindeer herder, Sergei Kichimov, talks about how Luke Oil would pay the Khanty people or Khanty families about 2,200 pounds to sign away the rights to their land, sometimes giving them documents that they weren't able to read or that were very difficult to read. And so he sort of talks about feeling forced to give up his land, and he talks about the encroachment of Luke Oil onto that land, which makes absolute sense because, as we know, the region is home to one of the largest oil fields in Siberia, certainly, and an extremely large oil field, just sort of in the context of the world. And so owning more of that land seems like a reasonable goal for a company that would want to exploit that land. But we see some issues with that, right? And so I have, the pictures I put up here are very interesting to me because these are actually promotional pictures. The company who is building this pipeline did a news story and they released these pictures. But you can sort of see, things that are seeping into the ground at the bottom of these pipelines during building. And we also, I think this picture is very interesting to include because it's dark, it's snowing, and nobody looks very happy. But if you were to log on to Luke Oil's website, very prominently, you would see featured social responsibility programs and sustainability images. And you would be able to open those reports and read about all the things Luke Oil is doing in terms of making sure that their practices are sustainable. And this is true with just about every Russian oil company, American ones too, honestly. So it's a pretty widespread practice in the industry. The reality of that, it's complicated. The reality of that sort of starts to get complicated because it's very difficult to engage in a practice that is inherently disruptive to the environment and still maintain sustainability. But even so, it's very important clearly to these oil companies, especially to Luke Oil, that their image remains that of a socially responsible, charitable company that is interested in preserving nature and preserving the world and how people are able to live in that. And so, especially in regard to the Khanty people, we see that reindeer herds are impacted and fish populations are impacted. And so this is a problem because the entire Khanty economy is sort of based on reindeer herding and being able to follow reindeer as they move throughout the country. And the issue with that is, of course, with the with the addition of pipelines and oil infrastructure, those migration patterns are disrupted and reindeer die off. Fish populations are impacted more significantly, and there are studies that sort of suggest that after ecological disruption, fish sort of start to avoid the area, and they learn that this is not a safe place to be. So even if that sort of comes to a halt, there's no guarantee that fish would return for quite some time. And of course, indigenous groups are disproportionately impacted by this, especially the Khanty people. We talk a little bit about encroachment on the land, and so even if a Khanty family is unwilling to sell their land to Luke Oil, as pieces start to be bought by the company that surround them, right, the reindeer herds will still be impacted, the fish populations will still be impacted, and overall it sort of just becomes very dangerous to live on that land, especially if you are relying on a natural relationship with the world around you in order to survive. So I want to talk about the city of Kogalym, and I use sarcasm quotes for a reason. You know, So the oil drop statue, which is also what Dr. Stoff has as her background, is one of my favorite monuments in the city, because right here you can see Lukoil's logo, and you can see oil harvesting equipment and oil refining equipment. And if we were to walk around the back of the statue, we would see like people and buildings coming out of the oil, which is like a very direct visual representation. Okay, the town was built on oil. It is sustained by oil. Oil is something we need to survive. And so even though for populations like the Khanty people, Lukoil's success is to their detriment, right? The more successful Lukoil is at harvesting oil, the better it is for the people of Kogalym. And that's a very interesting dichotomy, because, you know, the success of these two people can't necessarily coexist in the same space, or at least on behalf of the Khanty people, it can't. I don't think that the success of the Khanty people would necessarily impact the people of Kogalym. I've thrown up this news story just because I think there are a few things about it that are extremely striking to me. So Lukoil, to assist UGRA in the construction of new public facilities. UGRA is the region in which Kogalym is situated. And so here we have the president of Lukoil sitting right next to the governor of UGRA, the Lukoil flag, the UGRA flag, and the Russian flag in between them. They are legislating together. They're sitting together as equals, you know, seemingly with equal political power. They've agreed on changes that need to be made, and they've agreed that Lukoil is going to fund those changes. And so because of that, I don't really see Kogalym as a city, right? And the difference between Kogalym and Perm, for example, is that the infrastructure of Kogalym is entirely dependent on Lukoil. And you know, to a lesser extent, clearly the rest of the region the infrastructure of the rest of the region is dependent on Lukoil. And so I really see Kogalym as a subsidiary of Lukoil, just sort of another branch of the oil company, because without Lukoil there is no Kogalym, right? In the case of Perm, the city would continue without the existence of Lukoil, but in Kogalym, the maternity hospital, the airfield, the church, there's an Olympic sports center that is being funded by Lukoil, the theater, the kindergarten, all of these things that are funded by Lukoil and are dependent on Lukoil's money may not be able to continue if the company didn't exist. And so I guess the question is why would Lukoil do this? And the answers are deceptively simple, right? There's money to be had, right? There's oil nearby, and maintaining Kogalym is like a nice place to live is a great way to maintain a strong labor pool for harvesting that oil. And so briefly, I want to speak about what we might expect to see happen in the future. And I say might because, you know, we are in a recession, in a sort of a new recession, and it is too early to tell what's going to happen. I remember probably like 4 or 5 months ago, I walked into Dr. Stoff's office yelling, which was not uncommon for me, but it was like angry yelling this time. And I was like, Dr. Stoff, they finally did it. She was like, oh, good to see you too, Emma. What did they do? And I said, they joined OPEC. And I had written, you know, 15 pages about why Russia would never join OPEC. And I was very upset that this decision was made without, you know, my direct consultation, of course, because these major economic decisions should be made with me in mind. And so when they weren't, I was a little upset. I finally calmed down and stopped yelling. Dr. Stoff said, you know, it's okay to be wrong sometime. And I became visibly agitated. No, it's not. So then very recently, I had come to terms with Russia being part of OPEC. There was a disagreement. OPEC said to its members, and OPEC, I should probably mention, OPEC is a UN body that is for oil producing nations. We need to reduce supply of oil, so we should decrease production of oil. That will increase the price and increase revenue, which is sound. And Russia said, we are not going to do that. And then they left OPEC, and it was like a knife in my heart all over again. I was like, well, then what did I scrap those 15 pages for? If it was just temporary. And luckily, we were all online at this point, so I wasn't able to, you know, walk into Dr. Stoff's office yelling. So she was spared, spared this time. So I have included here Lukoil stock, so we can sort of see that there has been about a 50% drop from the high to the low of the year, a little more. And we just sort of see from February to March where things tank, right? And the point of all this is to sort of say the success of Kogalym is dependent on the ability of Lukoil to produce oil, and also and is also dependent on that oil being worth something, right? Because if the oil isn't worth anything, or if nobody can produce oil, then sort of that endless wealth that has built the town, in a place where it is not easy to establish infrastructure, disappears, and we have no idea what happens next. And so now we're in a place where oil isn't worth a lot, right? If you go to your gas station and fill up your tank, and it's not very expensive, which is great for the average consumer. It is pretty terrible for the people of Kogalym, because all of a sudden revenues have been cut by like 50%. And there is no telling how this plays out for them. And I will say Kogalym survived 2008. But this is a little different because it seems to be much more directly related to Russian oil. And so I guess that's one of the economic dangers of living in a place like Kogalym. But there are greater dangers than that. Dangers to the Khanty people, cultural danger in terms of revisionist history, right? To live in Kogalym is sort of to let someone else choose what elements of your culture to preserve and prioritize. And in the case of the Malateatr, it may not reflect you at all. And so essentially, the citizens of Kogalym are being exploited for profit in exchange for living a comfortable life that is not their own. And that is a choice. That is a choice they've made. My concern, is probably more with the Khanty people who are sort of being forced out of their land. But the situation is just sort of very interesting in terms of how we got here, and the fact that Kogalym is sort of a corporate city, just right in the middle of Western Siberia. All right. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Emerald, I think we lost like the last line. It sort of froze for a second. Would you mind repeating what you just said?
I'm not sure where you lost me, but no. So the dangers of there are economic dangers of living in a place like Kogalym in terms of if you allow oil to be the primary driver of your economy, and there isn't a lot of diversity there. When something bad happens, it becomes a tricky situation, and there's no telling how things will turn out. There's just danger to the Khanty people in having a corporate city like Kogalym, and then also there's a cultural danger of living in a place that is sort of defined by revisionist history. And then to live in Kogalym is to let someone else choose what elements of your culture to preserve and prioritize. And especially in the case of the Malateatr, those choices may not reflect you at all. And so I just think it's very interesting that the corporate city of Kogalym has sort of taken such a stronghold in Siberia and continues to grow.
Okay, so as I said at the beginning, we're going to proceed with questions from Emerald's committee, which is composed of myself and Dr. Popova. And so, Dr. Popova, I'll go ahead and let you ask your questions.
Stop sharing.
Thank you, Emerald. I was trying to figure out how to do that myself, or just move myself back to seeing everyone. So it seems to me that one of your big themes for your overall thesis is this question of like creating the legitimacy of place, right? So to make Kogalym actually be a city and seem like a city. And you posited at the end of your talk that it really just isn't, right? It's a subsidiary. It would like rise or fall with the I guess the success or failure of Lukoil as a company. But I want to hear a little bit more about how you think that women and sort of this concept of, well, women create legitimacy of place. So what is it specifically that does or does not create legitimacy for specifically Kogalym? Because sometimes you talk about shift cities, but really what you're talking about when women are there is not a shift city really anymore. And then also, I was a little bit unclear about whether or not it's the ethnic Russians that they're trying to draw towards them, or just sort of like this purifying nature of classical Russian education. So when you talk about what it's at the Malateatr, it's like they've chosen classical Russian kinds of like plays and things like that to do. But that quote that you read earlier on was talking about sort of taking that Russian classical like background and equating it with virtue from the text that you were talking about for Perm. That seems to suggest that it's not so much the ethnicity that matters as this sort of like tie to sort of a Russian identity. So I just wondered if, so it's sort of two questions. I wondered if in this quest for creating a legitimacy of place, it's essential for Lukoil that they be ethnically Russian, because you said it was only 60% of the town that is, or are they actually caring more about like using this Russian cultural idea as this sort of like virtuizing or force that makes people more virtuous or sort of more civilized?
Yeah, so I think first in regard to women, there's a specific kind of woman that is essential in legitimizing place, and so the teacher is a really good example of that. A person who has something to add to the town, and so those, as opposed to like the Khanty women, which were always around, and you know, clearly were not helpful in moving Kogalym beyond shift city status. I think it is identity that plays a big role in that, and I don't know that it's necessarily ethnically Russian identity that is so important, but I think that Lukoil ties the notion of being ethnically Russian with those classical purifying values, and so they appear to be the same thing, even if they're not. And so, I guess in terms of women in education, right? It's the educated woman and the woman who can educate. And in terms of tying Kogalym in a greater sense to the Russian identity, I think it definitely has more to, I think what is more important is values that Lukoil considers to be ethnically Russian, which are classical values and values that we might consider pure. And we talk about classical arts, and which the company sort of holds in contrast to folk values. And there are a few different definitions of that. But like it is very evident that what the people of Kogalym should be seeking out in terms of leisure are those 200-year-old Muscovite values that sort of tie in with the old Malik Theater and what you would see in Moscow. And that's why I think it is important for the people of Kogalym that we would regard the town as Moscow, which seems interesting to me. It would sort of be like if I said to all of you, look, you don't need to go to New York City because in Tempe, Arizona, it's exactly the same culturally, but we have cacti. And it's just not quite an example that makes sense or holds true. Sorry, I think you're muted, Dr. Popova.
Stoff's being, I have to let Dr. Stoff give me the power. I just have one more sort of like question after that, then I'll let Dr. Stoff talk, and I'll let her mute me. So one, I wonder if you talked about how it's a subsidiary city, but that sounds an awful lot like it's doing some very fine work for the Russian state in state building, if they keep talking about the importance of these values. And that's connected to, I think you didn't talk about quite as much as I would have hoped in your talk, but although you do have more in your paper, about sort of the flip side of this, of course, is the delegitimizing native conceptions of space, right? So again, in their crafting of this narrative of this place, they also do some pretty nice work for the Russian state of just showing that it doesn't even seem like the Khantu people have really anything to do with the development or the creation of the space, although clearly they were there. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this, or whether or not you think that this is a state building project, like Lukoil is actually helping the state, or is this just a useful technique for them? And do you really think that it hinges upon them also really at the end of the day de-emphasizing or delegitimizing native conceptions of space?
I think in terms of the government, this is something I go back and forth on, right? Who really is wielding the power in these negotiations, right? Obviously, Lukoil has money, and the government has goals that they would like to achieve. But is it the government that is conceding power to Lukoil, or is it the other way around? And I think ultimately what I've landed on is because Lukoil just sort of has this seemingly endless supply of wealth. It sort of is the company that is legislating on behalf of the state, but also to sort of leverage that relationship to become more powerful. And I do think that delegitimizing native space becomes important in terms of making people feel like Kogalym is an institution in the context of the land. And so when you walk through the Museum Exhibition Center, you will see some limited representations of Khanty people when they talk about like the reindeer and the natural world, and they'll tie it with that. But at the same time, you know, for every like piece of Khanty memorabilia or fact, you will see 3 or 4 symbols of Lukoil, right? Very literally, whether or not it's written or not. And so I think it's sort of it's sort of a visual representation in the context of a museum of that encroachment on land and the reasons that that space is sort of it's sort of necessary for Lukoil to claim that space as their own. Otherwise, the legal issues we see, and I know I only brought up one example, but there are ongoing legal issues between Lukoil and the Khanty people, and actually, you know, the Khanty people and various oil companies. Right? Khanty land is sort of chock full of natural resources and access to oil, and that is obviously very sought after by oil and gas companies. And so to delegitimize Khanty spaces, to make that land easier to appropriate as part of the oil industry, and then sort of sell that as if it always has been. And that's why I think it's important not just to sort of like just to sort of have a friendly relationship with the Khanty people, but to make it seem like there has been a friendly relationship that has been ongoing for a number of years, and that you know, together the decision has the unanimous decision has been made to give this land to Lukoil, when in reality that's not quite the truth. It's false. It's a lie.
Okay, Dr. Popova, did you have any further questions that you'd like to ask? Okay, so Emerald, I first want to say, like, I think this is a fantastic piece of work, and I'm very impressed with all of the research that you've done. But I thought maybe it might be useful for those who were not in on the process of our weekly meetings for the last year, how you came into this particular project. Because when we first started, this was going to be an economic analysis of the impact of heavy reliance on oil harvesting on the Russian economy and whether that was sustainable or not. And there were lots and lots of graphs and charts and interesting analyses of tax policies and economic things that I don't understand at all. And now it has turned into something quite different, which is about sort of the impact of this particular company on the development of this place, particularly culturally and socially. So maybe you could talk a little bit how the project morphed over time and why you were drawn in this direction.
Yeah, you know, what's interesting, Dr. Stoff, is if I had waited a year to pitch to you the original topic, we would have had a lot more to work with than just sort of my 8 pages on taxes. Not very fun to write. I'm sure even less fun to read. Yeah, this started as like a very broad topic that, in retrospect, it was not very doable. And what was very interesting and very kind is that my thesis committee never really said no to me. They just were sort of like, well, let's keep thinking about it. let's make sure that you know, we're going down a path that will lead us to a conclusion. It almost doesn't matter what it is, but as long as you could say something substantive, let's do that. And so we just sort of, you know, narrowed down piece by piece. All of a sudden, you know, the taxes weren't reasonable to include anymore, and it, you know, I was writing equations that that made sense but weren't a lot of fun to take in and understand. I think the turning point was probably when I read the piece on Rogers, and I was like, oh, you know, the economic impact is interesting, but it is a question that has been asked and answered many times. And I thought back to the Mali Theater, and we had extensive discussions about that and what that meant. And, you know, I think with Dr. Popova and you're sort of saying, yeah, this is what we need to focus on. I was able to focus more on Kogalym, and I think, you know, whether it was intentional or not, I had come to know a lot about the town during this process. And I submitted my thesis prospectus on April 4th of 2019, so 367, it's a leap year, 368 days ago. And every single day I have thought about Kogalym in some capacity. And I think probably it was a natural progression to just sort of focus in on that and write on that, because it just seems so different than other towns that had experienced that. It seemed very different than Perm, because Perm is sort of its own entity, right? And there are things to be considered in other places, in places like Perm, and other problems that we could talk about in relation to the oil industry. But the relationship was so unique, and the changes were so ongoing in terms of infrastructure, and I think probably the thing that settled it for me definitively was when I found out that Lukoil had built a Russian Orthodox church in Kogalym, and I was like, this is this is the only thing I can think about now. This is all I am interested in talking about. We still got a graph in there. We still got some economic conclusions in there, but I think this is much more compelling to sort of situate conclusions about identity and questions about identity in economic data, as opposed to like grounding economic data in economic data, which is horribly boring. You know, as an economics major, even I will concede that. So I think that's how we got there. Is those two pieces of reading in addition to my thesis committee sort of saying, Emerald, this is what direction we need to take.
And just for the record, I even though I'm not an economist, I didn't discourage you specifically. I just thought this was a good way to go, right?
No, you were very kind about letting me sort of take it in the direction I wanted to.
But I did want to ask a little something of an economic question, because you mentioned using Suchlin's work and Schulman's work, and I just was wondering if you could say a little bit more about. We don't really know that much about the ways in which this illicit economy developed. This sort of black market economy developed alongside the licit economy. But we probably can surmise, we can guess that there was some sex work going on, especially in the early days when there weren't a lot of other women there. So do you have any idea about how the transition occurred from a place where there were very few women, the women that were there were probably engaged in sex work or not permanent residents, to this place now where there's a very significant population of women who are actively involved in this, as you call it, cultural curation of the city and its impact on the people that live there. So maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think it started, so for me, there's like a very clear transition. But it's something that I meant to say during the presentation that I sort of left out completely by mistake is that oil has taken on the role of what an illicit economy does here, because it is the main driver in a place that is not, very economically diversified. There's infrastructure that is specifically targeted to harvesting oil, and that is the priority. And so in a way, Kogalym sort of has those characteristics of an illicit economy still, even though, of course, the economy is licit, right? Some of those undesirable characteristics are still very present in the economy. And so the transition, I think, between illicit and licit economy is the arrival of those teachers in 1977. And there are a couple reasons for that. The first is, obviously, the women would serve as indicators of like a legitimate economy, and because they are not engaged they're not engaging in sex work, or to our knowledge, they are not engaging in sex work. They sort of represent like good women, and the things that you would want, or I get the things that maybe would be desirable for a place where a person could settle down and raise children. So the teachers, and then also women with husbands, and so the deputy director of the museum. The Museum Exhibition Center is an example of that. She arrives with her husband, and they stay for 15 years, and they end up having a son, and it's all completely by accident, but it just sort of happens, and you have a life in Kogalym. And so I think there's an idea of a legitimate woman, and it is it is that presence that kickstarts the economy into transitioning from illicit to licit, and that is the point where people sort of decide, oh, we need to do something about this illicit economy, and we need to focus our efforts into prioritizing legitimate economic development and infrastructure. And so you have people arrive and start storefronts and start providing services and slowly but surely, it is no longer a place, it becomes a place that is no longer appropriate for the illicit economy to continue.
Okay, so that's all for my questions. If there are people who are in the audience and they'd like to ask some questions, I'd ask that you submit them to the chat. So we have one question already from Professor Moldavekova. So Emerald, do you want to take that question?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
So I guess the question is, will Lukoil survive the recession? And if you believe that they will, I would say buy and hold for like 18 months. And I will tell you this, Lukoil did survive 2008 and will probably survive this recession because there seems to always be a demand for oil. This looks a little different. I don't, you know, I worry because there is a direct price war between two countries. I would say if you hold stock in Lukoil, hold it, don't sell it, but don't buy anything. That's my opinion. Yeah, fair enough. Hope for a recovery.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna buy up a bunch of shares right now. All that extra money, that sweet, sweet ASU money. Okay, thank you very much. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to submit for Emerald? You can type them in the chat.
I would welcome them.
And yes, and we would welcome them. No, no questions? Okay. Well, thank you all for oh, here's one. Okay. Wait. Okay. Good timing. Sorry.
No worries. No worries. It has been. So that's a really good question, Spencer. Are there other towns in Siberia across other oil-rich regions of Russia that have seen this kind of investment? And so the reason Kogalym is so unique is because of the size of the oil field that lies nearby, that is on the border of the town. And also the fact that the land is rural. So, okay, oh, we've opened a can of worms. Okay, here we go. So a couple of things to understand. There are rules for sort of being considered a settlement or a town in Russia, and there's what I call a 12,000 people rule, and it is that's not the real name of the rule, but essentially you need 12,000 people in a permanent settlement for the town to be officially recognized by the region, and so in smaller shift cities that cannot be considered towns because they do not meet those qualifications, it becomes a lot harder for oil companies to make those investments, especially because you know it's you would be hard pressed to find a place with as much easily accessible oil as the oil fields in Kogalym. And so that's the reason that things are there is no sort of status quo for this oil industry, and that's the reason why Kogalym is sort of unique and has been adopted as this corporate town. And you see other examples. I talked about Herm a lot. You see other examples of Lukoil investing in other towns, and that's a good way to sort of uphold the labor pool and drive profit. But in terms of just building things for people, that's pretty unique. That's something that I've only really come across in Kogalym. Molly says, for the company to be able to fund multi-million-dollar cultural projects, what do their overall profits in Kogalym look like? So that's a great question. And the answer, Daniel, is about $102 billion. As of 2017, that is the last time that the corporate finance statements were released. And I was actually just looking over them last night. And so it's hard to say exactly how much of that oil, how much of that money comes from Kogalym, but my understanding is that in order to invest that much money, that level of into developing that level of infrastructure, it would have to be a significant amount of money. And again, right, because we've seen that oil is now worth a little bit less than it has been in the past, it is sort of becoming, maybe it's now sort of become less profitable, and so it's hard to say. But the company is a multi-billion-dollar company, and when I say $102 billion, I do mean U.S. dollars and not rubles. Lived experience of a transition from a shift city to a real city. Sorry, the chat is moving. Yeah, so there's a story that just, it makes me so sad, and I must have told it to Dr. Stoff like 8 times. And it is the head architect from Azerbaijan living in this sort of like tent wagon with his wife, and every night her hair would freeze to the side of the wagon. She would say, "When can we go home?" And he would say, "When it's done." Just, I'm laughing. It's not fun. It's such a terrible thing. But I think there's like a hardness of the oil frontier that doesn't necessarily exist in Kogalym anymore. Right? The weather is still less than ideal. However, infrastructure exists so that people can now have a place to go, and Kogalym sort of does start to feel like home for people. And so I think that is what marks the transition from a shift city to a real city. Is it a place that can feel like home, and does it have people that sort of you can communicate with, right? In a shift city, you see a lot of times people don't speak the same language, and they're from all sorts of different countries, and they don't know each other at all. And so when you can start to build those bonds of camaraderie over, for example, like Lukoil's branding, then you will that sort of is the transition, I guess. And so, yeah, just thinking about the architect's wife. When can we go home? When it's done, and it's still not done. They did go home, so it's fine. But things got hairy for a while there because they didn't know anyone, and it was terrible work. But okay. Amelia says, how the residents of Kogalym experience negative biological effects because of the proximity to oil field use is affecting the bottom line of Lukoil. So Amelia, I was actually reading a study a few weeks ago about the mortality rates of mothers in Kogalym, and this was in the context of a bigger study about blood types. And it's hard to say what is causing negative effects to people, right? And those sorts of things are difficult to ascertain. I will tell you this: I don't think that that damage to the health of Kogalym will affect Lukoil's bottom line. I don't see that as being something that will be particularly impactful, in part because the residents of Kogalym sort of I think there's an understanding that in order to achieve financial solvency, there are some things you have to give up, and so, and I will also say that I think that the biological effects have not necessarily been studied, but there is not a lot of evidence that there have been significant biological effects, except for that one study about the mortality rate of mothers, which sort of suggests that there is some sort of problem in Kogalym, although it's hard to say where it is or what it is. And so, yeah, I think ultimately it's one of those things that we will have to. We'll have to wait and see. Kogalym is about 50 years old, and hopefully in a few decades we will know for sure. Or actually, hopefully there will be nothing to know, right? Hopefully everyone is safe and healthy in Kogalym. And I didn't include pictures of this, but there are some images of Lukoil storehouses that were taken by people and sort of added to the Google Maps place, and it's interesting to look at because it is not a place that you would want to spend any time in, right? It's dirty and it just doesn't look very inhabitable. So yeah, it's a good question. I wish I had a better answer, but my intuition is that yes, there are some negative impacts, and that no, it will not affect Lukoil's bottom line.
Okay, any other questions? Like, you're already getting congratulations. Like, we haven't even deliberated yet. I'll give you a minute just to, if anybody's typing anything in. If you are committed to other things and you need to leave, we absolutely, you have our blessing to do so. And if there are no more questions, then what am I going to do? Send Emerald away to a break room? Is that how this is going to work?
I will.
Do we even have a break room? We
Yeah,
need the lobby.
I think we can do that. Let me see.
I will mute my computer and leave the room if I.
Well, no, you don't have to do that because I think I can.
We can do a breakout session, Dr. Stoff.
A breakout session. That's what I'm looking for.
No.
The breakout session.
We can break out and they can stay.
Right. I'm looking for that little feature. This different than my...
Maybe Emerald has to break us out.
Oh boy.
Yeah, maybe.
Hang on.
It should be under manage participants, right?
Manage participants?
Yeah.
I got nothing.
Yeah, I got nothing either.
I think maybe because we're just in my meeting room and not in a meeting. I wonder if
maybe because you're not
you don't have all the bells and whistles.
You don't have all the bells and whistles. Yeah, usually it's under manage participants.
I don't have it either.
Oh, wait. Advanced.
Getting fancy now.
That's not it. Oh, I know what we can do, Dr. Popova. We can chat to each other privately in the chat.
All right, let's do that then.
Okay.
So sneaky.
So sneaky. All right. Bye. We'll be back.
We'll be here.
Great job, Emerald.
Well, thank you.
Congratulations.
Great job, Emerald.
Emerald, you're incredible. Hang on, do you
Emerald, can I trade you for Ethereum?
You would be getting
picturing the mom.
The mom.
This is your mom approval.
And since I'm not working right now, since I work at the high school, I've been working on my TikToks and doing the renegade.
I'm so glad to hear it. Oh my God. I'm glad. That's good. Those are the things that we should be pursuing.
You're gross.
I'm muted.
I just okay, Amelia, here.
That was like my favorite defense I've ever been to be honest with you.
Thanks. That was quite a time, wasn't it?
It was so good.
We learned a lot.
Yes.
We had fun.
We learned a lot about Kogalym.
Yeah.
This is not a town that I knew anything
You
about.
said that with a Spanish accent.
No.
You did. You did that.
I'm not muted.
Hey, Emerald, I do have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
So now that Kogalym is sort of established as a town, if you see this like price war continuing for oil, do you think that Lukoil can now use the people of Kogalym as like a bargaining chip to obtain subsidies from the Russian government in case things start to go under?
So that's a good question, and I worry that the answer is no, because typically, all these things have been funded by Lukoil, and so a subversion of that I just see as something that is not very likely.
Okay.
And I also worry that Lukoil, that Kogalym is a priority for Lukoil, so long as they're in a good financial situation to keep exploiting that oil reserve. But if that changes, I think that the priorities would change very rapidly, and probably what would happen as a result is that the people would be forgotten about and not a priority, and the field would be revisited in a few decades when things were better. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So then, I guess, do you see the oil war then as a war between private entities in these countries rather than the countries themselves?
So that's super interesting. And here's what I'll tell you about Saudi Arabia's oil company. And this was, and this was a few months ago when actually Aramco, which is Saudi Arabia's largest state-owned oil company, went public. And so what happened then was, so essentially what happened then was privatization was sort of skipped over, and so for Saudi Arabia, it's a public, it's a government oil industry, and then the Russian one is sort of more public. But I will tell you this, there are several oil companies that are about half owned by the Russian state. And so I think that honestly, the lines sort of blur between public and private industry when it comes to oil, in regard to these countries. And so I think that in a way it is sort of very representative of like public people feuding.
Thank you.
Yeah. Long time no see.
Hi.
Hello.
Wait, am I muted yet? No. Okay. So confusing. Dr. Popova have decided that your thesis is a pass. So we do have a few suggestions that we will put in the Google Doc. And really, it's just kind of small things to clarify, to create some smoother transitions. Some of the things we've already been talking about a little bit. We'll have to look back and see what the deadline is for submission, but I think the advising office is being fairly flexible at this point, and you're way ahead of the game. So I think you're fine. So take a week or so and look at those comments, and then get it back to us, and then we'll sign the form. I don't know even how they're doing it. The advising office has not been very forthcoming with directions, but I think the idea is that there's a title page you can download off the Barrett website, and then we sign it, and then it's good to go. So congratulations, Emerald. Great job. We're very proud of you.
Thank you very much for sticking with me through this year, this 368 days. It was a lot of fun.
You did amazing, Emerald.
Yes. And we'll miss you.
I'll miss you too. This is very bittersweet.
It is, especially since I won't get to medallion you at graduation. That's a little sad for me.
Sorry to hear that, but no, that's very unfortunate. Yeah, I would say next year, but next life, I guess.
Next life. I think they're going to let you go to winter graduation next year or something. I don't know what they're going to do, but
I'll show up. Maybe I won't.
This year will be virtual. You'll get a virtual medallion.
I'll get a react. I'll get a.
Yeah, you'll get.
It'll be enough for me.
You'll get a thumbs up from everybody. Right? Exactly. Lots of clapping and lots of thumbs up. That's all I can do. Can't even give you a smiley face. That's
no.
lame.
There's no negative reacts, which has really been cramping my style because
there's no negative. Oh yeah, it's clapping or
bad pieces. Well, yeah.
Pozdravayo. How about that? That's what we need, right?
Well, thank you all. Thank you both.
Yes.
I really appreciate the mentorship that you both have shown me in particular. I remember walking in the first time I walked into Dr. Popova's office, also yelling. That's the theme.
I just thought that was your normal voice.
It's a Jewish thing, Laura.
It's so normal for me to yell at Bear Professor that they just oh yeah, that's Emerald. That's your normal voice. So yeah. So no, and it's been nice. It's been a 4 years that I think have calmed me down a little, not a lot, clearly, but yes. So it's been, and thank you for both for sticking through the thesis even when the topic wasn't.
It got closer to what I'm interested in. I win.
Yeah, me too. I have to say, the first economic stuff, I was like, all right, I think we need to get someone from the economics department on this because I have no idea what half this stuff means. So it ended up, I think, actually better.
And a lot more interesting for everyone, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Awesome.
I think you get to be free now and just go
Yes,
party
you're free.
in that classroom all by yourself. Just go wild, Emerald. Go wild.
Thanks,
Sit
everyone.
around on those chairs.
Yeah, absolutely. No one will stop me.
Thank you again, Emerald, for letting us join. I mean, and be here and ask questions. It was I learned so much, and finally, now for when you reference Kogalym in class, I'll now be like, oh yeah, I know exactly what she's talking about. It was fantastic.
And you can all visit. Like, look how beautiful it is.
It's like that all year round, I bet.
I'm sure.
Beautiful place.
I
70.
should have put up a snowy picture, huh? That would have been better.
Nah, gotta have.
I wanted the oil drop. I really wanted to find the oil drop that in.
Yeah, it's a very important monument, I think. But no, things have, things are changing, but probably not for Kogalym. That is what we've learned. Things change, things stay the same. So.
All right. Well, have a good day, Emerald.
Thank you, everybody.
Try to celebrate